You see the people also? אורי, איך יש לי רגע מכולה? אוקיי.
רגע, אבל בתהילה יש...
בואו תצטרפו ליד השולחן.
תעבור קדימה.
מה זה?
תעבור קדימה.
זה פשוט שם.
כן.
Okay, so I will start now. Good morning to everyone. And welcome to our second panel. This first day of our conference, embracing a conflict resolution approach to the Jewish democratic challenge, deals with the foundations for our project. And this panel, which will be conducted in English, will discuss conceptual aspects of identity-based conflicts. All of our panelists are conflict resolution experts, I allow myself to say that, from Bradford, UK, Gurion University of the Negev, and Bar-Ilan University. Their talks will give us some international and interdisciplinary perspectives on conflicts similar to ours and on our Jewish democratic own tension. They will discuss the prospects and challenges of dealing with such conflict constructively. This panel will help us perceive our ethnic, religious, national tension of the Jewish democratic formula as an example of identity-based conflict and to learn from other experiences dealing with equivalent tensions. I'm sure that it will further equip us with relevant models and tools which can be used later during this workshop and when designing our own approach for consensus building and constructive engagement with the Supreme Court and elsewhere, within the Supreme Court and elsewhere. Each speaker will have some 20 minutes talk, and then we'll have some time for questions and answers and for a dialogue, and especially, we hope for a very productive and interesting panel. So, we will begin with our first speaker who joins us from England. Professor Oliver Ramsbotham is an emeritus professor of conflict resolution at the University of Bradford, UK. He's president of the Conflict Research Society and former chair of the Oxford Research Group. He's co-series editor of the Ruthless Studies in Peace and Conflict Resolution. His books include Transforming Violent Conflicts, Radical Disagreement, Dialogue and Survival, the Contemporary Conflict Resolution Reader, Contemporary Conflict Resolution Edition 4. He has When Conflict Resolution Fails, Engaging Radical Disagreement in Intractable Conflicts. So Oliver is our expert, international expert in identity-based conflicts, and thank you, Oliver, for joining us on Sunday. I know it's not simple, and for this conference. And Oliver will speak about promoting collective strategic thinking within identity groups when conflict resolution between them is premature. Please.
Thank you, Michal. Okay. So the first question is, can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Good. Do let me know if you can't. Michal, before the clock starts ticking, perhaps I can say just one or two things. By the way, did you say we each have half an hour? I've been preparing 20 minutes.
Yes, I said 20 minutes.
Is that all right?
Yes.
And it's easy to expand.
No, 20 minutes is
okay.
Not negotiable.
Just before my clock starts ticking, I would like to thank everybody for the honour of speaking at your conference, and also to thank you for having this session in English. So I hope I will speak clearly enough to get the ideas across. The task that I've been set, as I understand it, is to speak about conflict resolution and identity conflict. I won't be referring specifically to Israel, but Israel, like my country, the UK, and all countries, face these problems. We are all different, but there are echoes where we can, I think, learn from each other. So I'm hoping that what I say will be stimulating for this conference. If we look at my title, just before I start, and I'll repeat it, Promoting Collective Strategic Thinking Within Identity Groups when Conflict Resolution between them is premature. I must say a few words about the second part of the title first, when conflict resolution is premature. Some of the problems that face conflict resolution in dealing with identity conflicts. And then the second part of my presentation will be one example of something you can do, how you can adapt conflict resolution in the face of this challenge. Conflict resolution always has to be prepared to adapt itself to change. I think you each have a two-side handout, which I did on Thursday. I'm actually going to be speaking to you without notes, because although I may lose a few points, it's more immediate. There's also, I think, a visual on the board for the second part of the talk. My final preliminary remark, therefore, I'm going to give myself one other one, actually. I'm pleased I am not wearing a mask, and this is because, so far as I'm aware, coronavirus variants cannot yet travel across the internet. When they can, I think we've all got problems. My final preliminary remark is about conflict resolution. I take the term conflict resolution here to be the blanket, the covering term, which will include peaceful conflict management, conflict settlement, conflict transformation. So I have a broad sense of the term conflict resolution. So, Michal, I submit myself now to the ticking clock and begin my presentation. I'm going to start with what I call the mismatch between states and peoples. In 1945, when the UN was founded, there were 50 member states. Today there are about 200. So 3/4 of the member states of the UN, their borders were determined during the process of decolonization. And they are dwarfed by the thousands of overlapping, cross-matching distribution of identity groups and peoples across the world, different economic systems, different cultural systems, much older histories, rise and fall of empires, conversions, and, very important, migrations, which we still are grappling with today. Now, the problem for the main UN-based conflict resolution system, which we still have, is that originally it was established to prevent interstate war. Now, my own field of conflict resolution is contemporaneous with all these events. In other words, it began in the 1950s as a specific field of study with university centres. And from very early on, those in the conflict resolution field recognised this problem. They recognised that although there were still interstate conflicts and wars, and at geopolitical level, there was the great standoff between the superpowers which structured a lot of those wars. Nevertheless, there was a prevalence of different kind of conflict. Originally, they called it deep-rooted conflict or protracted social conflict. Let's now call it identity conflict. Now, in what ways does identity conflict challenge existing conflict resolution resources? Well, in my field of conflict resolution, I will mention 3 of them. First of all, from early on, it was recognised that there were problems of structural asymmetry, imbalance of power across the different groups. Some groups were deprived of what they called basic needs. Individual needs were channeled through collective needs. All forms of power operated in this way, including Gramscian types of power or Foucauldian types of power. The net result was that some people found their basic collective needs denied. What are these needs? Well, the CR theorists identified needs like identity itself, security, when police forces, instead of defending you, become oppressors, autonomy, some control over your political future, and development, hope for your children and grandchildren. When these were denied, you have the breeding ground for these kind of identity conflicts at a high level. The main points were that these were non-negotiable. They are existential. Hence the intensity of these conflicts. The hopeful thing in the eyes of CR specialists was that they are also non-zero sum, they claimed. In other words, my security depends on you feeling secure. You can avoid an arms race type situation. Or my development depends on your development. So that was one major constraint on traditional forms of interstate conflict resolution. A second one was the early recognition of systemic complexity. Some of the theorists were systems theorists. Now we need to do some concrete illustrations, otherwise we become too abstract here. So for example, sometimes a minority is in the power position over the majority, demographically. Let's just take the obvious examples of Iraq, where Saddam Hussein's regime was based on the Sunni minority. Next door in Syria, it was the other way around. It was a Shia, the Alawite minority, that was the basis of the al-Assad rule. And in fact, that was decisive. The reason why the Alawites stuck by Bashir al-Assad was because if he fell, they would suffer all the consequences of being a minority. And that, plus Russian intervention, probably tipped the balance, and is why he's still around. So these are portentous issues. We can look at parts of the world, just to give an idea of this systemic complexity. We can look at parts of the world like Latin America, where identity conflicts are not associated with secession. Why? Well, you go into all those analyses. You can look at a country like Afghanistan, why not? In our news all the time. What is the basis for identity conflict in Afghanistan? Is it ethnic, Tajik, Uzbek, and the Pashtun majority? We can think of the Durand line, which divides completely artificially Pashtuns in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Almost impossible for the international conflict resolution mechanism to cope with that. Or is it ideological? We can think of the Taliban. Or is it a resource struggle? Greed versus grievance debate. Or is it actually an interstate struggle by proxy, which is very common? Now, I think we can say it is all of these. It is complex. And I will go further than this. I will give you the image of your looking out for a window at night time and someone is shining a torch through that window. All the scratches on the window pane, which you can't see in the daytime, all seem to radiate around that torchlight. The torch moves to a different position. A completely different constellation of scratches emerges. This image conveys the fact that theories, models, never fully capture complexity. And this is very salutary for theorists to ponder on. And the third example I give of problems posed by identity conflicts for the international conflict resolution system is a lot of early and existing conflict resolvers are social psychologists. And social psychology takes you down, the classic areas of study were escalation, intensity and dehumanization. And if you have a peace treaty dealing with post-traumatic stress in peace building. Now, all of these are problems for the international conflict resolution system. But amazingly, and let's just note this on Pascal, a miracle happened in the early 1990s. The Cold War suddenly came to an end. There were no more quarrels in the Security Council, I'm exaggerating. And suddenly, all over the world, the system started to work as it was meant to work. So peace operations, those of us who are older can remember them, beginning with Namibia was the first, Cambodia, El Salvador, all over the world, this kind of template suddenly seemed to be put into operation with peacekeepers. And it was based on, institutionally, the UN and its agencies, the international financial institutions, regional organizations, IGOs, INGOs, NGOs, and it included a kind of almost a consensus, this liberal market consensus based on democratic elections, introducing market economic reforms, and law, constitutional law, minority law, and international treaty law. Some of those treaties, they summed up all sorts of sub-treaties in Christine Bell's terms, softening sovereignty to take account of identity groups. It even got to the point where American troops, for one brief moment, were prepared to wear blue helmets. And in Macedonia, astonishingly, they did so in order to prevent conflict. Hubris, swiftly followed by nemesis in Bosnia, in Somalia, etc. Now, I won't go on with this, but there were critiques of this system strong critiques from political realism, from a statist perspective. There were strong critiques from critical theory, from a Marxist perspective. And let's end this tour d'horizon with thinking of the rise of China. Now, there was talk even of the end of history, that finally an epochal moment in humanity working together to eliminate the worst results of violent conflict. But what if the whole conflict resolution structure is actually not the end of history, but simply a construct of Western hegemony, with the passing of Western hegemony? What if it's not the end of history, but the end of conflict resolution, as we have known it? How does China respond to identity conflict? Perhaps by denying it and crushing it. So, there we are. Now, I'm going to move very quickly over the thing I've spent most time analysing in recent years, which is the communicative dimension of all this. This is what most people see as so I'm just adjusting to visual shifts. This is what most people see as the core of conflict resolution. I mean dialogue. I mean problem solving. I mean negotiation and mediation, confidence building, reconciliation. Here, the blockages, which I've spent a lot of time analysing, are radical disagreements, the actual communicative blocks to this. And if you look at, my notes have just fallen, I'm going to pick them up. If we look at the handouts, you can follow this at the bottom of page 1. That when you look at these disputes, they are actually under-researched. And you find that they are about what they are about. There's a vocabulary struggle to couch the disagreement in a certain terms. If you succeed, you've halfway to winning. reach, I say, to the distant horizon, and it is not adequate to describe them as a mere coexistence or equivalent narratives, when that is not what the people who are arguing are saying. Dispute about issues tends to collapse into ad hominem judgment, and in comes all the social psychological dimension. And for me, the most interesting and under-researched is the distinctions invoked by the conflicting parties, such as justice, injustice, fake, genuine news, etc., I've written out there, are part of what is at issue. I'm not going to go on with this part of the talk, but when you take it all together, it is not surprising that in the face of identity conflict, conflict resolution, including community conflict resolution, has problems. I don't want to overestimate failures. There are many, many successes, but we do well to realise, to take seriously failures and try to learn from them. And I say so far fail because they can always succeed in future, although so far can go on for a long time. Now, if in the second part of my talk, which will relate to what you have on the screen in front of you, here is one way in which I'm suggesting that conflict resolution can adapt in the face of these problems posed by identity conflicts. So when identity groups are not yet ready for conflict resolution, communicative conflict resolution between them, and remember, I'm an advocate of conflict resolution. They often do work. But if they don't work, then a sensible thing to do is to begin where the conflicting identity groups are, rather than where conflict resolution wants them to be. This means beginning within the identity groups, when you can't yet do conflict resolution between them. Where are they? Where do they want to go, and how do they get there? This is collective strategic thinking within identity groups. Why should identity groups be prepared to do this when they're not yet ready for conflict resolution? Because they want to overcome internal differences in order to attain collective goals. Why can this nevertheless prepare the ground for conflict resolution across and between identity groups? Because of the nature of collective strategic thinking, which I will now briefly go through. This is it is different to the normal kinds of military strategy, commercial strategy, party political strategy, behind closed doors, with public manipulation. Collective strategic thinking within an identity group is necessarily public. It needs to be fed in to the national dialogue at leadership and grassroots level. And in this way, it can help to overcome what's called the problem of re-entry, which I won't go into, and the problem of preaching to the converted. The conflict resolution tends to be between moderates. And I'll say a word about that in a moment. Now, if we just look through what I'm calling outline of a methodology for collective strategic thinking within identity groups, a word on each. First of all, who are we? Identity groups are not monolithic. We can invoke chaos theory here, that you take a bit of this complex, and it's equally complex. You go all the way down. Any identity group has sub-identity groups. Individuals will be part of different identity groups. Now this poses problems for conflict resolution. In my experience, and I've done a lot of this work, disagreements within identity groups are, if anything, more passionate than disagreements between them. This is a block to conflict resolution. Also, here's another complication I'll just briefly do. Let's say you've got a majority and a minority. Let's take the majority. within that majority, there will be elements who have grievances against the hegemons within the majority. This means they may have certain interests which you would think would be in common with the minority. But in fact, quite often, they are at the core of intransigence against the minority who they see as rivals. All these complexities. Nevertheless, because of the hybridity of identity groups, there are always differing constituencies which open space for the possibility of conflict resolution. If you move on to where are we, you analyse a complex system. If you are a challenger, being the weaker party, and you want to change this complex system, you have problems. It is a system. It goes across sectors, political, economic, and it goes across levels. You change 1, 2, or 3 elements, and it'll fall back into the default position. On the other hand, it's complex. And in complex systems, you don't know what the outcome of particular actions will be. As the environment changes, this is a well-known feature, a system can hollow out. So when change comes, it's sudden and unexpected. This is catastrophe theory. We can think of 1979 and the fall of the Shah. We can think of 1989 to 91, the collapse of the Soviet Union. We can think of 2011 and the fall of certain Arab regimes. This tells you that when you're analysing where you are, strengths and weaknesses, power is defined strategically as the ability to reach your goals. And there are different forms of power, which I think we are familiar with. Not just, in these cases, military power didn't work. So you need to be able to choose the type of power that will most likely get you to reach your goal. If you look ahead to where do we want to be, here, for example, a possessor, the more powerful party, may not want to give up anything. Any giving up would be to weaken their position. On the other hand, there are still openings here for conflict resolution, because in the debate within identity groups about where they want to be, you're looking at scenarios, possible futures, not just in terms of desirability or undesirability, what you want to promote or block, but in terms of attainability and likelihood. And this introduces a certain realism. Moreover, identity groups do not agree about the future. Take something like Scotland. The Scots, as an identity group doing strategic thinking, disagree about the biggest question of all, Scottish independence. They're split down the middle, passionately, splitting families. Here, what is helpful is you look at short-term, middle-term, long-term goals. So I'm just showing you again how in each of these areas you can open space for the possibility of conflict resolution.
Oliver, we have 2 more minutes and we have to finish, sorry.
Have we run out of time?
Yes.
You think, okay. A word on each of these then. How do you get there? Different strategic paths. I say paradox because you may have to go backwards in order to jump over a blockage. And so I will go on. A word on internal local empowerment means that the message to your own constituency and from a conflict, from a strategic perspective, you want to increase the participation of everybody. This is very good for conflict resolution, where there's a general agreement that the basis for peace will be the empowering of local communities. Engaging with the other, here you are playing a chess game. should you look at the chess game from the perspective of the other? And the answer strategically is yes, because otherwise you will lose. Yeah, even though that's your motive, you are still looking at what the other will do, trying to anticipate it. You are still looking at what motivates the other. You are looking at where you can apply pressure, and so there's an opening for conflict resolution. Finally, with third-party involvement, which is often decisive here, regional and international levels, conflict resolution itself acts as a third party. I say the illusion of neutrality, because when you intervene in these intense identity conflicts, third parties need to realise that they are not neutral or impartial or disinterested. It's not up to them, and act accordingly. And my last two sentences are, the aim of this will be to open strategic space even in times of intense conflict. You keep the sails up, because if you don't have the sails up, you won't move where you want to go, no matter how many winds are blowing. And this challenge of ethnic and other kinds of identity conflict, the last paragraph there, is going to go on as new social formations emerge, new generations challenge the power distributions and norms of their predecessors, and the process of second-order social learning is never complete. So I've looked at difficulties in conflict resolution, and I want to emphasise at the end that there are many successes. And I think I slightly mistimed my presentation, but there we are.
Thank you, Oliver. This was fascinating, and I hope we can hear more during the Q&A, and also people can read the outlines, and you ended with a hopeful note, and this is important for the field and for us. So our next is two speakers who will share 20 minutes. One is Professor Orna Braun-Lewensohn. She is a full professor at the Conflict Resolution and Conflict Management Program, and serves as a Vice Dean at the Kreitman School for Advanced Studies at Gurion University of the Negev. She received her PhD at the Faculty of Psychology and Education Sciences, Vrije University, Brussels, in 2007. Her major research interests include mental health outcomes and coping during or following stressful events. She also focuses her research on integration of academic minority women into the Israeli workforce. The focus of her research is personal as well as communal coping resources in different cultural groups. Her theoretical perspective is the salutogenic model of Antovsky and the coping theory of Lazarus and Folkman. Orna is part of the organizing committee of this workshop, which is co-sponsored by the Israeli Academy of Science, and I thank her for that. She and Tehila, who I'll present soon, will be also mediating Supreme Court cases in the simulations we conduct this afternoon, and we also thank them for that. And now Tehila. Dr. Tehila Kalagy is a faculty member in the Department of Management and Public Policy at the Guilford Glaser Faculty of Management, Ben-Gurion University of the Negev. Her main specialization focuses on the study of minority policy with an emphasis on ultra-Orthodox and Arab society in Israel, in the areas of integration in education and employment, individual well-being, intercultural management, and public health. Tehila served as the director of the Haredi College in Jerusalem and was a partner in the opening of dedicated academic programs for Haredi society. In light of her research and professional experience, Tehila is considered an expert in the field of planning research and higher education policy for minority groups and their optimal integration in the economy. So Orna and Tehila will both speak about identity conflict among minorities while integrating into the democratic state. Please come here, and I will put your presentation.
Thank you, Michal. Today we would like to present a significant issue concerning the dynamics between a minority group with a conservative identity and the democratic state and its authorities. In the last 2 decades, significant changes have been taking place in the ultra-Orthodox world with regards to higher and professional education and entry into the world of employment. This present study chooses to take a strategic focus on this population integration in Israeli workforce. By examining the various findings, we try to formulate an approved format balancing the ultra-Orthodox community's desire to continue its isolation with the demands of the economy and the environment outside the community. Ultra-Orthodox Jewish society in Israel and its leadership are particularly concerned about the acquisition of higher education and integration into the Israeli economy. In general, there has always been a fear that higher education, higher academic education, will lead to a less religious population and even assimilation. This study describes the meeting point between the acquisition of higher education among the ultra-Orthodox public, integration into the workforce, and emphasize the broad implications of the process. The research also characterized the ways in which ultra-Orthodox academics cope with the integration into the Israeli economy based on the social identity theory, realistic conflict theory, and the strategies of acculturation proposed by Berry.
Okay.
So we will start by presenting two main theories in which are the foundation of our research. One is the social identity theory and one is the acculturation theory. And it's important to say that the study that Tehila mentioned and we will present was analyzed through the lens of these theories. So the social identity theory was founded by Henry Tatchfeld and John Ternan, who were social psychologists, and it was based on their previous work. So think about different groups to which you belong. As you think about those groups, how do you feel about those groups and about your membership in them? Michal mentioned before that we transfer from one group to another, but I claim that we belong to different groups all the time. For example, if we are a member of this research group, or if we are a member of parents of first graders, etc., etc. And these groups become what are part of us, and they build our identity. So before the dean mentioned the group of Arabs which are studying here in the Faculty of Law. So this is one of their identity group. It's important to integrate them so they feel part of it, but this is part of their social identity which is being built. So what is social identity? Social identity is part of how individuals see themselves. Social identity is a component of identification with a social group. Individuals' self-perception is constructed in part by their awareness of their peer in different social groups. Individual social identity is also based on how they assess the emotional importance of their membership in the social group. So this theory is important because it has practical implication. It can help the formation of different social mixtures at the organizational level and on social level. Okay, so I want just to mention also the realistic conflict theory. The social identity in relation to the social identity theory. Social identity theory emphasizes the identity of the individual. Realistic conflict theory emphasizes material resources. Material resource theory emphasized the development of preconceptions, stereotypes, and discrimination as outcomes of struggles over limited resources due to the different goals of different groups. And now I want to invite you to think about integrating ultra-Orthodox women and men into the academic studies. What part of it is of social identity, the conflict that is forming, what part of it is social identity conflict and what part of it based on the realistic theory. And this is just to put it in your minds, thinking while we're...
The study of cultural process aims to understand what happened when different social groups come into unmediated contact with one another and the subsequent changes in behavioral patterns in our or both groups. This slide here shows Barry's model, which we use to examine the process of ultra-Orthodox Jewish in Israel in receiving higher academic education and the entry into the workforce. Barry formulated 4 patterns of encounter strategies adopted by the minority group in their encounter with the majority culture. The first definition is as assimilation, abounding the culture of origin due to the desire to adopt the culture of the majority group. The second definition is as integration, conserving the culture of region alongside the desire to come into contact and connect with the majority group. And the third definition is as a separation, voluntary or enforced conversation of the culture of origin and lack of desire to connect with the majority group or adopt its culture. And the fourth definition is as marginality, forfeiting the culture of origin without adopting aspects of the majority culture. And the enclave in transition, it's a combination of 2 terms commonly used in the study of minority groups and traditionalism. Their combination has characterized ultra-Orthodox society in recent decades. The ultra-Orthodox society in Israel numbers 1,175,000 people. Fertility rate of more than 6.6%. The percentage of ultra-Orthodox below the poverty line is much higher than in the general population, with almost half of ultra-Orthodox families and almost 2/3 of ultra-Orthodox children living in poverty. The main reasons for this: low employment among ultra-Orthodox men, low income from work, and large families. The employment rate of Orthodox women is approaching that of other Jewish women and is double the rate for Arab women. The employment goal set for 2020 has already been reached. 20 years ago, the employment rate for ultra-Orthodox men stood at about 35%. Starting this year, there was a significant change in the employment rate, which reached about 51%. This process, which taken place over the 2 last decades, is especially relevant to the ultra-Orthodox women, as men only joined this process over the last decade, entered into the workforce, a step which they were previously against. So there is about 13,000 ultra-Orthodox students in Israel in all the universities and the classes.
Okay, so now we will move on to present our study. And in our study we used mixed methods, which means it was qualitative and quantitative. The quantitative study was based on a sample of 747 participants. And they represented all streams of the ultra-Orthodox society. The ages ranged between 20 and 59 years old. The qualitative study included 4 focus groups in which 15 women and 11 men participated. Their ages were 20 to 56 years old. There was occupational diversity. They became also from all the streams of ultra-Orthodox. And there were college-educated or university-educated, and there was a control group of individuals with professional training. So I'll present only, we will mainly discuss today the qualitative study. I'll just present a little bit of the quantitative one. So the qualitative research question were what difficulties do ultra-Orthodox individuals encounter in their integrated workforce? How do they deal with them? How does the encounter with the non-religious space affect participants? How do these ultra-Orthodox individuals maintain their principles when conflicts arise at work? And what strategies do college-educated ultra-Orthodox individuals employ in their workplace? As you see, mainly our focus was on the individuals and how they cope with conflict and stress when they enter the workforce. So a little bit about our sample. We see that we have mainly women. They were mainly married and had children. Most of them were academics with bachelor degrees. They work in the profession that they study in the university. And most of them worked with secular co-workers, then with both secular and ultra-Orthodox, and just a little of them worked in the enclaves just with ultra-Orthodox party. We see that mainly they were studying accounting, then law, after it computer science, and business management. And one of the questions in the quantitative study was, are there differences between those who are working inside and outside the enclave? And we see here 3 different groups. Those who work especially with secular, those who work both with secular and ultra-Orthodox, and those who work with ultra-Orthodox. I show here just a part of our variables. Sense of ultra-Orthodox coherence, which means how much the ultra-Orthodox community important for us, how do we feel as belonging to the ultra-Orthodox community. And we see that those who work in the enclave were those who have the highest score in the sense of ultra-Orthodox coherence. Then those who work both with secular and ultra-Orthodox, and to lesser extent, those who were just in secular. Although we can see that all are on the above the average of the scale.
Are these statistically significant? The
yes, I show just the statistically significant differences. Then we go to another variable called openness to the world, which means how much we participate in secular so-called activities in our job. For example, going to a wedding of a colleague, going to field trips of these communities. And we see that the more that you work with the secular, the more you participate in such things. A level of religiosity, we see that both those who work with both secular and ultra-Orthodox and those who work with ultra-Orthodox report more religiosity than those who work with just with secular. And the last thing, which is important economically, that the economic status that they report, those who work with secular outside the enclave report that they earn more than those who work in the enclave or both with secular and ultra-Orthodox. So I think it's not a nice picture for the rabbinical system.
So from the qualitative research we learned a few very interesting things. The category employment outside the community includes 3 models of ultra-Orthodox workplace. The first is a workplace that is not ultra-Orthodox, and the second is enclave within a mixed workplace. And the third, employment in a national religious sphere. Despite the initial dichotomy that the study aimed at an ultra-Orthodox workplace versus a secular workplace, in other challenges arose in a different working environment with national religious people. It turns out that the challenge of working with the national religious is the most significant one, especially against the background of shared religious identity. As Shoshi said, but there it was actually easier for me to maintain my boundaries because the differences were so clear. As opposed to today, when I work in an offices with many religious people, and it's like, what's the difference between them and me? I'm religious too, and I sometimes feel that it's not okay to present yourself as more religious than someone else because they are also careful to observe halakha. So you can tell them that's not okay. It was a lot easier to work there than in a religious place because my boundaries were stronger. The encounter of ultra-Orthodox in the mixed workplace creates daily tensions on a religious basis, or as evidenced by the findings such as prayers, level of religion supervision on the food, social ties, and gender segregation, among others. The strategist is to prevent the conflict is advanced by imposing a veto on problematic areas from their point of view, thus preventing unpleasant dilemmas, such as participant on a formation trip for employees to Nahar Yarden. Another practice that has emerged among women, imagine for themselves a psychological buffer through which they detach themselves from that they hear or are exposed to in the workplace. As one of the participants already mentioned, Rachel, they asked us to be on call in the evening, and the question of yichud come up, as well as the fact that it's a much less serious atmosphere. They order pizza and everyone sits around together late at night. So I try to come up with the solutions, like working remotely from home, but we are not connected. So that means going to the home of someone else who is connected to the internet and working remotely. The important thing is to make sure that we don't mix them with them. Truth is, they agreed as soon as work remotely from home. According to the study participants, some of the women aspire to work in an ultra-Orthodox place since they believe that there are considerations that are more important than the level of income. As one of the participants already mentioned, over the year I did look for work. I saw that it was hard for me to be in a place that wasn't ultra-Orthodox. That may be a type of conflict. Even when they offered me 2 times the salary or stuff like that, as soon as it's a mixed environment, that's it. I will stay where I am. I'm completely ruled that out. Okay.
There are many interesting stories.
Yes. So Tzvika concludes, it's not that you have to actively do something. It's just learning to live with this complexity. You need broad shoulders to learn to live with the conflict in this area. with regard to this subject of friend and identity. You need to learn to deal with conflict, and there may be those who will have a harder time, and they will need to make changes in terms of value or something.
So I know it's a little bit superficial, but we have limited time. If we go back to the social identity theory, which I present at the beginning, creating a new social identity for a group that is formed, for example, a work team, is one of the solutions. The studies in peace education show that the best way to bring together people is in the workplace. For example, Arabs and Jews are working best at hospitals. We saw it during the Corona, but even before in Soroka Hospital in Beersheba, we see it every day. So when a strong new social identity is formed, it overcomes the preconception that individuals have about those from the other groups, for example, ultra-Orthodox and Arabs. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Orna and Tehila. And then our last speaker, first I will presenting, Dr. Daniel Roth is a core faculty member at Bar-Ilan University's graduate program for conflict management, resolution, and negotiation, where he teaches graduate courses on religion and conflict resolution, as well as supervises graduate students. His book, Third Party Peacemaker in Judaism, Text, Theory, and Practice, was published by Oxford University Press in spring 2021. In addition, Roth is the director of Mosaica's Religious Peace Initiative, which serves as a network of insider religious mediators advancing both religious peace and mitigating crisis situations in Israel and the Middle East. Roth also works to connect religious leaders to the 10th of Community, Mediation, and Dialogue Center throughout Israel that Mosaica supports. And I know Daniel from working with him in the past. He does amazing work with religious leaders and dialogue, and now he's doing even more. So he will speak about the role of insider religious mediation in mitigating crisis situations and advancing religious peace. I will bring your PowerPoint here. Move the slides yourself.
Okay. Where should I stand? Thank you, Mickey. It's a privilege to be back in this room where I've had the opportunity to speak many times, in particular over the summer, where I think the whole summer program is actually based around identity.
I forgot to mention, yes.
Identity-based conflict, and I've had the privilege of teaching as part of the law school for pre-corona, maybe 4 or 5 years about this, and I'm glad that this conference is focusing once again on the role of identity in conflict. So I guess as being the third speaker, my talk sort of connects back to what Professor Ramsbotham was talking about, which is more intergroup conflict, identity conflict. But yet I appreciated the stop into the world of religion, because I didn't hear the word religion so much mentioned in Professor Ramsbotham's discussion. So I'm really going to take us into a totally different realm of identity conflict. You might have heard of it. It's called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's a small identity conflict. And I want to kind of start... מה? את במסך?
לא, פשוט תעלה, תצביר למסך. זה מה שאורי אומר לי לעשות.
מצביעה? I'll continue talking for a moment. Okay. So Professor Ramsbotham, I think, did a really good job outlining the challenge of still not going.
did something terrible. 2 years with COVID and we are still struggling. Putting a PowerPoint.
And this new, PowerPoint, what's that? Okay, now this is, no.
I stopped the clock.
You stop the clock? Time just stops. At the very end of Professor Ramsbotham's discussion, you mentioned the role of the third parties. Okay, so you have these identity groups. They're intractable. They're stuck. We know sort of what doesn't work, which is just UN agencies doing international problem solving, as was noted. But what I want to focus in is sort of where he left off, which is what is the identity and the methods of the third party, who actually can mediate in an identity conflict, which I think is often overlooked. Okay.
There we go.
Should I use this? So I'm going to present some key findings of a publication, a different publication in the book, which I wrote specifically on this topic, called "Insider Religious Mediators: Advancing Religious Peace in the Context of the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict," and start off with this term that, for me, I think is really part of the missing piece in the puzzle, which is insider mediation. That it was almost implied. It was explicit, actually, I think, in Professor Ramsbotham's conversation, where the third party are either government agencies or international organizations, and then the problem of neutrality. My argument here is that while the third party peacemakers, mediators, can be important, they're far from being sufficient once you're talking about identity conflicts. There, you don't need people that are neutral, you need the opposite. You need people that are super connected and part of the communities that are in conflict, and that is the term that's often referred to in the literature as insider mediators. And here I'm just including the word insider religious mediators for obvious reasons, that often identity conflict and ethno-national conflicts often include a strong religious component. So just using the UN definition of a booklet that's called "Engaging with Insider Mediators," defines insider mediators as an individual or group of individuals who derive their legitimacy, credibility, and influence from a socio-cultural and/or religious, and indeed personal closeness to the parties of the conflict, endowing them with strong bonds of trust that help foster the necessary attitudinal changes amongst key protagonists, which over time prevent conflicts and contribute to sustaining peace. So, in other words, if you're not connected to the bad guys, to quote one of the great insider mediators, I'm not blanking on his name, from England, Ramsbotham for sure knows him, where he said, if you're not connected to the bad guys, you're not actually going to be able to help solve the problem. And a lot of the international communities either cannot be connected to the bad guys, or you have a lot of nice coexistence projects that also have no idea how to engage them. So just to bring a few examples that are often cited, in Northern Ireland, the work of religious mediators who are deeply connected to the militias on the one hand, and had formed a network with each other on the other, who helped bring about ceasefires and create a ripeness for the politicians to be able to meet. In Nigeria, the famous case that's often cited of two heads of militias, a Christian militia and a Muslim militia in Kaduna State, that work together to this day. And there's a whole story of how do they become connected. But once the two heads of the militias started to work as the mediators themselves, that created a game changer in terms of the ability of how to intervene. A program that's a cousin of the program that I direct in Malmö, Sweden, where there's the highest degree of anti-Semitism in all of Europe, where you have a rabbi who's originally from Tekoa, who's serving there as the rabbi of the community with an influential imam, who together they are the mediators, going back and forth between the most extreme factions, particularly within the Islamic community, to fight both anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, solving problems on a daily basis. So, within our context, okay, I'll define very broadly, again, I'm not doing justice to this in our very short talk. The religious peace, here I'm contrasting that to what is often known as the Kantian secular peace between states. Okay? It's a war and peace. It's a peace between the people. It doesn't exclude political peace agreements, but it goes beyond just political agreements. That is on the foundation of shared religious values, and not only religious leaders then being signed on to the bottom of a political peace agreement, as we saw, for example, in the Abrahamic Accords, which was not a religious peace. The necessity of advancing religious peace in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that it needs to first be defined as an identity conflict. And for 30 years, people continue to define it as an interstate conflict. You have this state, this head of the state, that head of the state, in which case the international mediators operate the way they have been doing, like Professor Ramsbotham had mentioned, for decades. And surprisingly, to very little success. The question is, who's in touch with the worldviews that are actually really deeply in conflict, particularly the religious worldviews on the extremes that are influencing the intractability of the conflict. And the argument is that religious leaders that are 99.9% aligned with the core of the influential religious leaders on both sides, if they are working together and are able to argue it out and come to agreements and then be able to influence within their own networks, separately and together, then you can both help save lives, constantly build trust, and ultimately bring about a much more sustainable, again, religious peace, which includes secular, and including specifically the worldviews that have often been excluded. All that's in theory, okay? What we did in our research was looked at 8 religious leaders that had been serving over the last 25 years as what we call insider religious mediators. The primary hero of the article is Sheikh Abdullah Nimr Darwish. Just a show of hands in the room that are here, how many of you know the story of Sheikh Abdullah Nimr Darwish? I think more people know it now over the last year because everyone's asking who Mansour Abbas is. So they have to know who is Sheikh Abdullah, who is his spiritual, religious, political leader. Sheikh Abdullah was the founder of the Islamic movement in the 70s, founder of the Usrat al-Jihad, the first kind of Islamic terrorist group. In the 70s, sat in jail, came out of jail. In the 80s, went through an ideological, theological shift towards arguing the need to integrate into Israeli society. And then in the 90s, supported the Oslo Peace Accords while at the same time being from the same kind of school of thought of Hamas. This is core to looking at the inner contradictions of insider mediators. It's almost like that the mediator themselves has more than one identity, which is part of their inner contradiction, which actually allows them to be directly aligned with the parties in conflict. So his ability to be aligned on the one hand with Fatah and those Palestinians that were supporting the peace agreements, and at the same time be religiously aligned with those Islamists that were against it, allowed him for many years to both negotiate between the different Islamic factions, and ultimately, in the middle of the Second Intifada, start to become very close with many religious Zionist leaders, and together work with them in serving as insider mediators, not just between the Palestinians. His primary partner in the last 15 years of his life until he died in 2017 was Rabbi Michal Malchior, who was a minister. Sheikh Raed Badir is the top Islamic leader who, behind Mansour Abbas, the head of the Islamic movement, the southern branch, plays an important role. Sheikh Imad Faluchi, Dr. Nasser al-Din Ashar, and Dr. Ali. All of them are religious leaders that have these sort of inner contradictory identities that allow them to be the mediators within an identity conflict. I looked at Rabbi Froman and the work that he had done, which was more well known, Rabbi Abi Gisser, and we get a shout out for connecting to the Michlala Achredit, also the work of a woman insider mediator, Rabbanit Adina Bar Shalom. Just to look at two case studies, and then I'll Okay, I won't go long. What I did is I looked at the methodologically. A lot of the work, I'll say, 90+% of the work of these insider mediators, by definition, is behind the scenes, and only let's say, heads of the Secret Service or other people know. It's not things that can be published. So I was limited in my methodology in terms of just things that have been published, archives that were in the library, and other things. But a good case study was, I'll look at two case studies, mixed cities and Jerusalem, Har HaBayit Al-Aqsa, the Temple Mount. So looking at the mixed cities, already in 2008, as those in the room probably remember, the incident around Yom Kippur in Akko, there were numerous factors that happened, but it was an important point that Sheikh Abdallah went with influential Islamic leaders and religious Zionist leaders together. It was their first time doing an intervention sort of in mixed cities to try to pull their networks together to try and mitigate the crisis situation that was happening and stop it before it became before it was worsened. There was a conference exactly, it was November 2019, so we're talking a year and a half before the war in May, where there was a whole conference of how religious leaders can serve as insider mediators to the 300 top Israeli police officers. I'm not sure if they were paying attention with all the notes of exactly how this works, because it didn't work. In May, they went through also how to work with the mediation centers that played an important role, and the grassroots and highest levels, but because in 2014, which was a case study presented to the police, where Yom Kippur and Eid al-Adha overlapped, there was a great example of identity conflict going head-to-head, which I won't go further into. And there were actually fatwas, Islamic rulings of the first time since the time of Andalusia, they say, that religious rulings saying how Muslims have to respect the Jewish holidays. And that being taught over and preached over in the different mosques throughout the different Islamic movements, meaning the southern branch and the northern branch, played an important role from their perspective in helping give the religious backing towards ensuring that there wouldn't be more breakouts of violence. Again, I deal with this as an academic, but mostly I deal with this in practice. I spend a lot of time in the various Jewish Arab mixed cities, which I think are an incredible case study of identity conflict, particularly working with the extremes, which I define as the Islamic movement, including the northern branch, and the Turanim, or what are called the religious Zionist communities within the mixed cities, in literally mediating back and forth between these different religious leaders. These are not dialogue groups. They're not facilitated, or this group and that group, and they talk about their feelings. It's very, very practical. Unfortunately, literally the day the war began in May, there was supposed to be a whole announcement of that they had come to an agreement about how to actually deal with certain things regarding to the muazzin, the Islamic call to prayer. The war happened, and there's lots of stories to be said about that, but we continue to be in touch primarily through other insider mediators that are going back and forth. But see the work of insider mediation in identity conflicts as creating networking or web of relationship. That if this religious leader is connected to that head of a militia, okay, whether it be in Northern Ireland or it be in Gaza, okay, and then that person has a deep trusting relationship to the next person, that creates a network of insider mediation that without it, identity conflicts stay intractable. Just briefly around Jerusalem, in 2017, this also made the news, with this I'll end. In 2017, there was, people might remember the previous Temple Mount crisis around the metal detectors, I'm thinking in Hebrew, around the metal detectors, and their Mosaica, which had a very good relationship training the Israeli police in cultural sensitivity. We just finished training about 100 different police stations around the country in cultural sensitivity on the one hand. On the other hand, our relationship with the Waqf and with the Islamic leaders behind the Waqf brought about an agreement that not everyone was happy, but it did try to prevent a major holy war. When it came to May, okay, without getting too much into the detail, but I'm in the WhatsApp groups personally of the Jews that go up to Temple Mount, the Waqf, and the police, so I get all the different angles of the identities as to how everyone's seeing it. And already that morning, I could see how everyone was sharing on their social media very, very different narratives that all spoke to their own identities. You can guess who's sharing which of these pictures. And our work was actually making sure to kind of bring about information that challenged some of the identity narratives of each side of the conflict in order to try to prevent holy war. We worked with the Waqf, we worked with the chief rabbi, who does not have much influence on actually the conflict here, but the heads of the Islamic councils that sit in Qatar that have more influence on what happens in Gaza and Jerusalem than anyone actually locally here. They don't know that, so we sent them directly by WhatsApp a message from Rabbi Lau saying the chief rabbi is saying there is no holy war, but it's these connections of constant. We deal all day. Mickey knows this, all day, all night, dealing with crisis situations, both in mixed cities, Gaza, West Bank, Jerusalem, and throughout the Middle East. But here's the bottom line: intractable intergroup identity conflicts, as opposed to what can be defined as material conflicts, require insider, in our case, in my opinion, also religious mediators that are strongly identified with and connected to the parties in conflict in order to mitigate crisis situations and ultimately build peace. Meaning the missing piece that I think the international community has often been missing is, can there be these leaders that are not necessarily the top most influential leaders, but they have major access to those leaders and deep trust in order that they work together to both constantly save lives, and when you save lives, you build trust, and then peace just becomes another functioning of being able to save lives and stop bloodshed. So with that, I'll conclude.
בעברית אני אתרגם.
לא, אני יכול באנגלית. You mentioned Malmo in Sweden.
Yes.
And because I'm fully aware about the situation with Rabbi Moshe Cohen,
yes.
I would like to ask you, both of the leaders, I mean the rabbi and the Kalagy, they were not born in Sweden.
That's right.
And they didn't grow up in Sweden. They came, Rabbi Moshe Cohen came from Israel, and the Kalagy, if I have not mistaken, is coming from England.
Lebanon.
Okay. So
but he moved as a child, as a 5-year-old.
Yes. They are in Malmo, let's say 5-6 years, not more. It means that they are outsiders. They didn't grow up and they are not a part of the community. So do you think that this has an impact about the success? Because, you know, they came out of the community, and all the community, the Muslim community and the Jewish community, are in big crisis. And 15 years ago, the community, or Jewish community, were 1,500, now is 400, 300, let's say. And maybe because they are in full crisis, and the peacemakers are outside, there is an impact.
So we're looking at a very particular case that I don't want to lose everyone on the details, but I'll argue that
with your permission, I think this is an example. Because this is very unique. So this could be an example how to try to solve problems, you know, resolutions.
Look, I'll say that right now, if the airports weren't closed, I was supposed to be going to Malmo next week. We are expanding. We're conceptualizing that model and expanding it to 15 other cities around Europe. And then your question becomes very critical. who is the rabbi, what's the right profile of the religious leaders that they can actually succeed in working as insider mediators? Do they have the right connections to the most extreme factions within whatever the conflict context is, and as well to the establishment? If they don't, then they're not the right person. So the fact that he was appointed only 5 years ago as the community rabbi, that makes him an outsider on the one hand. On the other hand, because he has the position as the rabbi of the community, that makes him somewhat of an insider in that context. The imam grew up there since he was 5. But it's an interesting question. If somebody just moved there 2 years ago, do they have enough of the connections? And I'll share, there was supposed to be a big conference 2 months ago, where they were going to have all over Europe to talk about this model about working with the extremes. And they squared it away with everyone. And there was one group that they forgot to actually square it away with that messed everything up. The conference was cancelled. Fatah. Who knew that the Fatah in Malmo, who were secular, so no one thought about making sure they include them in terms of the extremists, they're the ones who messed everything up. So the ability to be on top with all the different extreme factions in order to be able to solve problems is critical and has to be examined in each place.
Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I mean, I must say that Daniel, I look at you and it's that moment in the conference that I would really want to cry, because it's so wonderful what you do. And always, you know, Daniel wrote his thesis long ago about the Aron Rodef Shalom, about the tradition of Rodef Shalom in Jewish halakhic word, and you really practice what you preach, and a lot of what you have, we have to really, I mean, I'm very grateful for what you do, and I call him on May, said I'm doing this, I'm mediating this, and with the rabbi, with the Muslim, with the Hamas. I think, you know, if we speak about creativity, if we think about emergent solutions, if we think about surprising things, it's what religion can bring us. With the fact that people that you wouldn't dream that they'll have communication can really speak on the same page, and in a moment of crisis understand what is going on and just try to prevent more harm and more trauma that can have repercussions for ages. So I think part of what we're doing, we are preparing for such kind of cases. We're trying to prevent them, but this suddenly the variable of religion that suddenly comes in as a positive contribution to the processing of the project, and not just the model that we'll build here, you know, analytically and scientifically, and we'll use all the theories, but not the people that on the ground can connect and suddenly create a change and even hold some kind of a catastrophe from happening. I think it's amazing, and I think it's really, I mean, we have like 3 panelists, all of them giving one aspect, like Oliver giving us a kind of panoramic picture of conflicts, the conflict resolution field, of all kind of modes, and how can we try to overcome identity conflicts with their problematics. I think we have Orna and Tehila giving us an example of a kind of bottom-up integration, and the way in which religious minorities enter into the main group and the problems and create together with the more interesting spaces. And here, when we take religion to be a kind of source of communication, I think we have another theory about how can we build this model. So I think what I got from Oliver and Danielle is build this model together with the intra-group kind of dialogue, and don't forget the extremes, meaning try to work with them. And from you, I take really the whole idea that in some contexts we really have a very positive kind of economic or educational goal of working, or professional goal of working together, and then the challenges are different, and also create communities that can later be part of avoiding or at least creating new collaboration. But maybe we'll have now questions, or maybe someone wants to respond, or Oliver, if you want to respond to Danielle, or Orna, or Danielle. More questions?
Yeah.
Ori.
Yeah.
Oliver, yes.
Yes, thank you. I thoroughly enjoyed those two papers. Thank you very much, Orna and Tehila and Daniel. Orna and Tehila, on your paper, Social Identity, and at one point you said creating a new social identity. I mean, I think this is the deepest level of transformation, really, when you can say that those involved in identity conflicts are capable of or have created a new social identity. So I just want to ask you a little more about that. That sounds a very deep level. And Daniel, I've learned from you, I think your idea of insider religious mediators is also excellent. I don't know if you're aware that the person who, in my experience, introduced this kind of idea, but it wasn't to do with religious leaders, was John Paul Lederach, who 20 years ago actually really made his name in the field by criticising the idea that mediators had to be neutral and impartial. And he wrote, especially in the context of Latin America and Central America, on how there you need insider partial mediators who, first of all, have authority and connect with whoever is involved in those conflicts, has an insider understanding of it, and that is actually a more effective form of mediation. So it would be interesting to trace your idea back there. What I've learned from you is this idea of a network of insider mediators you mentioned at one point. That seems an extremely creative idea. I would like to know a little more about. So here, the insider mediators are themselves in touch with each other.
And the extremes.
And therefore able to bridge, because I think as Michal was saying, you don't just have one identity group or another, they're all cross-cutting, aren't they? So to deal with that, your idea is you then have a capacity for a network, and these are presumably individuals who then know each other, know each other's work, and you have a kind of resource within a Lederach's idea, which, as you correctly say, historically has not been the main idea of mediators. They come in from outside, often they're professionals, they have a methodology, and the methodology is not based on where the participants are coming from. So that would be something I'd like to learn more from you.
Maybe you want to answer, or we want to hear more?
I think we should hear more.
Yes, okay, yeah, everybody will collect the questions and then...
Yeah. Okay, thank you. This was fascinating and also touching, I agree. So I have 3 questions with each speaker. I'll go from last to first. So, to Daniel, I was wondering about these insider religious mediators. To what extent you find them, recognize them once they've already kind of evolved within the community, or whether these are individuals you can somehow kind of cultivate. So are these kind of organic developments, and then at some point they're capable of sort of providing their service, or whether you can sort of come from the outside as an agent of a conflict resolution and try to see, well, maybe this person can be a figure and see how they can work.
If I can nail your question, it's how do you identify who they are, and can you cultivate them?
To the extent that you're at all able to, and whether that taints their status within their community if you start working with them. That's one question. And to Orna and Tehila, to some extent in contrast to Oliver's presentation, and this also goes to sort of the methodology that you chose, but you described it very, say, at least the way I heard it, kind of individualistic or kind of solitary or even lonely process for these individuals kind of interacting with an unfamiliar atmosphere when they sort of arrive at these workplaces. And this doesn't sound at all like the process of, the in-group kind of developing their understanding of the interaction with another context and then going and interacting with it as a second stage. So to what extent does that come up, and whether you can think of a process in which these people at some point develop their own kind of in-group process that would make this interaction easier. So we mentioned Owen's presentation, or Dean, about the sort of Arab students here, and there's always this notion that too few is a problem, not just for the atmosphere as a whole, but also if you want them to be kind of a group that would support themselves in these interactions with kind of the general population. I was wondering, to what extent we can think of the design of these institutions in a way that would ensure that they're also a group that could sort of go through these group, kind of processes, and not only this kind of individual experience vis-a-vis the host institution. And then going to Oliver, I guess sort of the regular question that comes up when you push communities to do these kind of in-group definition processes before they engage with the other groups is kind of these risks of echo chambers or going to extremes. And if we deal too much with who we are and where we're at, we might arrive at a point that's too extreme to be able then to engage with the other groups. So to what extent should we be wary of groups doing too much of this internal work without engaging from the start with the kind of other groups around there? Thank you.
Oliver, you heard the question?
Are you asking me?
No, I'm just asking if you heard the question.
Could you just sum it up for me? It's quite hard to look. Was it a question for me? I didn't even realise it was a question for me.
Oh, sorry.
I'm so sorry.
Ollie, come here.
Well, I was just, sorry.
Can I ask the name of the... I'm Oliver. Can I ask the name of the person?
Hi, this is Ori. Hi,
Ori, I'm so sorry.
I've been on the emailing. I'm just asking about the risks that could come about from these kind of in-group self-definition processes, whether we should be wary of, echo chamber effects or going to extremes. If we do too much of this, who are we, without engaging from the start without groups? So that was the question.
Without groups. I think if I've understood you, it's very important that if you're referring to what I was talking about, collective strategic thinking, and I understand what you mean by outgroups within collectivities, I think it's extremely important that those outgroups are connected with by the particular identity group. Now, of course, you can define the identity group more narrowly, but at a certain moment you want these outer groups, if I've understood you, to be connected. In fact, it's vital. I think it's vital from the point of view of collective strategic thinking. If you want your identity group, however defined, to be effective, you want a participation of as inclusive a number as you can. But it's also, that's a very useful thing for initiating conflict resolution in these difficult situations. Because most conflict resolvers agree that in the end, it's empowering constituencies which don't have women, etc., 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 that is the firmest basis for long-lasting peaceful relations. If that's what you meant by those who are outside, that's probably running out of time, aren't we? That may not be a very satisfactory answer, Ori.
Thank you. I think we have not enough time to discuss it, but let's give also Orna and then Danielle can respond. Yes.
Okay, so I'll answer Ori and then I'll connect to your question, Oliver. It's true that what we presented was individual processes, but I believe that if many individuals are going through these processes, it becomes a group process. And we see it in the ultra-Orthodox women and also in the Bedouin Arab women in the Negev, which we also have a project we didn't present it today, but when one sees another, then it becomes something that all are wishing for. And I think the education and job market is the best. It is the best way to integrate these minority groups into the larger society, because it's interests. You know, when they see that their economic status is better, and I'm talking about women because especially women, ultra-Orthodox and Bedouin women, once they're going out to work, once they have a status of earning, doing money, then other women are looking at them and want it as well. They don't want to be the poor woman in the village, in the Bedouin unrecognized village. They want better life. So they go to the university, they see what's going on outside, and it's harder for them also to come back to the village. So it's a long, and this connects me to your question, Oliver, on the deep level of the change in the social identity.
שם תדברים כבר,
או
לשבת פה, אז תשבי פה, תשבו פה כל משנה. לא משנה.
The deep level of change is after years of doing these processes, it becomes deeper. But once they have shared goals, for example, as I mentioned in their jobs, then they become part of a new group, and these new groups influence their own old identity. So yes. I agree that it's a long process, but I believe that this is the
yes. Thank you.
The positive one. Yeah.
So I'll start by relating to Professor Ramsbotham's comment about Jean-Paul Lederich, who I think it's important to note that he's not only the founder of the field of culture and conflict resolution, but also he is one of the founders also of religion and conflict resolution. And for me, in my introductory chapter of my book, I relate to him in both sections. And his experience that he tells in the 80s of going into South America, having just done a PhD in conflict resolution and knowing exactly how to solve everyone's problems, walking into the village and just realizing that is not relevant. And then having to, do a back face and come up with what he referred to as the elicitive approach, which is how do you elicit both the language and the culture, and also understanding that mediation in traditional contexts, whether it be in the Arab context or historically the Jewish context, was always the inside partial mediator, never the outside professional mediator. So how to utilize that now in identity conflicts is a critical component of our work. In terms of your question, Lisa, how I'm translating it, I'll describe to you very simply how it works. See, I want to engage in a particular city, for example. Most recently, the mixed cities. Okay, I won't go into what's going on in Qatar and in Saudi Arabia, which is a little bit more complicated. But if you take a city, so first, I need to know who are the influential leaders that are there and who's willing to actually work to try to solve problems. Those are our two criteria. How I try to come up with that answer is I'm going to, work through my networks of who knows whom and who's willing to connect, hear what they say, and then everything I do I cross-reference with our partners down the hall, the Middle Eastern Islamic Studies Department here at Bar-Ilan, that we did a mapping of about 200 of the Islamic leaders in the country, northern, southern, etc., to see who's more influential than whom. And then you get into the essence of where crime is happening and violence is happening and where the conflicts are happening. And then you realize that the person who might have the biggest title has actually zero influence. He's a pakid, he's just somebody talking in the mosque. But the person who is able to go down and work with the crime families and solve problems and save lives, whether it be Corona, which we worked, by the way, we had a direct contract with the World Health Organization because they realized that our ability to reach religious leaders was greater in getting to certain communities that were not being influenced by the Ministry of Health. So you had to know who are the religious leaders that actually have influence on a particular difficult area. So trust hearing it and then cross-referencing it with academic research. And then the project becomes cultivating that individual. Every time they succeed in solving a problem, whether it be in any way saving lives, their status as a leader, they don't see themselves as a mediator, I see them as a mediator, goes up. Every time they fail, that's some reason their status goes down. So it's the project is constantly that they, as mediators, have more and more successes so that the bigger challenges they're able to meet.
Okay. I think we don't have enough time, and I think we learned a lot at this panel, and I hope we can continue to use it. One of the ideas about women, I think, is something also we haven't mentioned, and in any place where women were part of processes, more peace was happening, and also in religious peace, I hope they're becoming a part of it. And I think that the really surprising ways in which we find peace in places that are extreme, and we can collaborate with people across groups and build trust for moments of crisis, I think is something very important and in all levels of the discussion of this panel. We both went very high to understand the complexity, but I think we also remain focused on solution, on dialogue in the real, in the right moment, and a really constructive way of trying to think about these conflicts as the most important conflicts that are maybe in our modern society today, but also conflicts that we learn to deal with and will have to deal with, and hopefully in this conference we'll manage also to move some step forward in this process, and also counting on people like Daniel, like you, that are doing the work out there and not just talking about it in the academia. So thank you for Oliver for joining us on Sunday. We really appreciate that. Thank you for the panelists. Thank you all. And this panel is adjourned. And we don't have lunch for you, but we have lunch for